In previous videos, we've looked at some of the great father and son pairings throughout wrestling history. We're talking about people like Dusty and Cody Rhodes, or Bret and Stu Hart. But what about brothers and sisters? Surely there must be some of those in wrestling too, right? Well, yes there is, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Charlotte and David Flair. Now, we all know that in the history of wrestling greats, Ric Flair stands way up there amongst the best of them. Hell, there are many to this day who will argue he's the greatest to ever lace up a pair of boots. So when Ric's son David decided to enter the squared circle himself during the 90s in World Championship Wrestling, expectations were high for him to succeed at a top level. How would David Flair manage with this weight on his shoulders? Well, not great if we're being honest. No, rather than be the second coming of the Nature Boy, the oldest Flair son would prove to be a bit of a wash in the ring. Sure, he did find some measure of success down in Atlanta with him becoming a WCW United States champion and tag team champion alongside Crowbar, but there was never really any sense that he was going to be able to carry on the mantle of his family's name once that promotion went out of business in 2001. Now, if fans wanted to see someone truly carry on in the footsteps of Ric Flair, they'd have to wait until the 2010s, as that was when David's sister Ashley first stepped inside the ring after being signed to a WWE developmental contract. And once she was down in NXT and renamed Charlotte Flair, she'd instantly wow everyone around her with her natural aptitude for the craft, a natural aptitude that is rarely seen. In fact, so good would the Queen go on to be, as it stands today she's a 14-time world champion and 1/3 of the first ever women's WrestleMania main event, with this making her the rightful heir to the Flair throne in many fans' eyes. Even her father Rick claims she's better than he ever was, something he never said about David. But it's not all bad for David Flair, as since leaving the wrestling world behind, he's been able to settle into a civilian life with his wife and 2 kids. And all the while he's been raising his family back at home, he's been able to cheer on his little sister as her career continues to go from strength to strength, growing to the point that we're now at a stage many fans see her as the greatest female wrestler ever. But what about AEW? After all, they have their own brother and sister duo, Saraya and Zach Zodiac. Of course, most fans will have first become aware of Saraya back when she was working for WWE during the early to mid-2010s under the name of Paige, as that was when she became one of the early innovators of what would later go on to become known as the Women's Revolution. Hell, so much success did she find in WWE, during her time there she'd become NXT Women's Champion and a 2-time Divas Champion. But then this level of success was nothing new to the Norwich native, because way before she ever reached the WWE, she'd be killing it on the UK indie circuit, primarily in the World Association of Wrestling, a promotion owned by her father Ricky Knight and her mother Sweet Saraya. And the then rookie wasn't the only member of her family who was tearing it up in Norwich back in the day. No, anyone who's seen Fighting With My Family, the biopic of Saraya, will know that her brother was also an aspiring wrestler too, with him going by the name of Zach Zodiac. Unfortunately though, Zach would never make it to WWE himself, and this would mean he'd have to watch on TV back in England as his sister became a superstar. But at least Zach wouldn't have to do this forever, as eventually he'd get his chance to share the spotlight with Saraya, and this chance would come in AEW during the 2020s. That's right, after a neck injury had forced the former Paige into early retirement, she'd eventually managed to get cleared to return to the ring, with this leading to her signing a contract with that company in 2022, and from there going on to become the women's champion at Wembley Stadium. And right there watching her as she did this would be her brother Zach, with this turning out to be a prelude to him joining the company himself, as later that same year he'd begin working on shows like Rampage and Ring of Honor TV. Sure, he hasn't risen any higher than this as of the time of this video's recording, but that's partially because an injury has taken him out of action for a while. Once he returns though, there's every chance he'll be on Dynamite or Collision before long. Who knows, maybe he'll even appear on the rumored upcoming show Shockwave. And if he does, it could be a quick route towards the top of the card for the youngster himself, as he'll be able to mix it up with the likes of Will Ospreay, Kenny Omega, and Jon Moxley. As for Saraya, well, while she's settled into more of a mid-card role down in Jacksonville now, we could certainly see her finding more title success before all is said and done, maybe with a belt like the TBS title. But what about another star from the UK and Ireland, one who actually served as a manager to the Norwich Girl for a little while years ago on the UK indie circuit? Well, she's our next subject as it happens, or at least one of them. That's right, it's time to talk about the brother-sister duo of Becky Lynch and Gonzo de Mondo. Now, we're sure you're all very familiar with Becky Lynch. After all, she may be the biggest star in all of women's wrestling today, maybe the biggest star women's wrestling has ever seen. And that's a title she's earned by doing just about everything that can be done in the industry at this point, with her being an 8-time Women's World Champion, a 1-time Women's Tag Team Champion, Royal Rumble winner, the winner of the first ever Women's WrestleMania main event, and for a while back in 2019 at least, the biggest name in the entire wrestling industry. That said, Becky didn't always enjoy this level of success. Now, as we mentioned a moment ago, her story started across the pond on the indie scene of the UK and Ireland, with this being a far more humble place for her to learn her craft. But then, given she's from Limerick, Ireland, it's to be expected this is where she would first make her name. And all the while she was doing this, she was doing it alongside her brother, Gonzo de Mondo. Of course, Gonzo de Mondo might not be as familiar a name to fans, as he never managed to make it across to America to wrestle for WWE, but that shouldn't mean he doesn't have an important role to play in the story of his sister, as it was his fandom of wrestling back when he was a kid that first got a young Rebecca Quinn interested in the sport herself, and this led to the two bonding over their shared dreams of becoming a WWE superstar one day. Unfortunately for Gonzo, though, his time in the ring would come to an end in 2006, as after realizing he wasn't getting a chance to break through and head over to the US, he decided it was time to call it quits. And as for his sister, well, after a head injury forced her into temporary retirement, she'd finally gotten signed up to a developmental contract in 2013. And you all know what happened after that. After a decent run down in NXT and a rocky start on the main roster, Becky Lynch eventually evolved into her final form, The Man, the biggest name in all of women's wrestling. And once she had that character, there was simply no stopping her from shattering every glass ceiling that was placed above her. Seriously, as it stands today, she remains one of the biggest stars in all the industry and a surefire first ballot Hall of Famer one day. And while it's sad her brother couldn't reach those same heights himself, at least he was able to play a little part in her story getting there. Of course, Becky Lynch isn't the only current WWE employee who has a brother that also wrestled. No, elsewhere in the division we can find the exact same story playing out with Tamina and her brother Deuce. Yes, as the children of WWE legend Superfly Jimmy Snuka, it should come as no surprise that both Tamina and James Snuka would want to follow in their father's footsteps and step in the ring themselves one day. And so, that's exactly what they did, with the first one to do so being James when, at the turn of the millennium, he began working on the US indie circuit as solo Snuka. That said, the indies were never the final goal for him. No, he always wanted to make it to WWE. And this was a goal he would finally achieve during the mid-2000s, as that was the point he joined the SmackDown roster as Deuce, one half of the throwback rock and roll greaser tag team act Deuce and Domino. Was it a strange choice to completely repackage the son of Jimmy Snuka in this way and not acknowledge his family lineage at all? Yes, it was. But that was the decision that was went with at the time. And it wasn't as if it did the rookie too much harm, as while a member of Deuce and Domino, he'd become a tag team champion. And after that run was over, he'd eventually get to play something a lot closer to himself anyway, as it was in 2008 he'd be repackaged as Sim Snuka, a short-lived member of Randy Orton's The Legacy stable, with this run allowing him to finally acknowledge his island heritage. But while this run would sadly be over for the Snuka son by the time 2009 came around and he was released from his contract, it wouldn't be the end of the Snukas in WWE, because just 1 year later, Tamina would be hired by the WWE too, and she'd end up having a large amount of success of her own, as over the next decade or so, she'd be a continued presence on WWE TV, with her becoming a women's tag team champion alongside Natalya, and a 9-time 24/7 champion. No, much like her brother, she never did win the big one, but that shouldn't suggest she didn't make her father proud by achieving what she did. In fact, you could make a solid argument that of the Snuka children, she's by far the most well-known today on account of her longevity with WWE. And while it seems that she may have quietly retired at this point, we expect to see her remain with the company in some kind of backstage role for some time yet, all while her brother continues to do his own thing elsewhere, both of them safe in the knowledge that they've carried their family's legacy into the next generation. But not every family in WWE is a real one. No, sometimes we've seen kayfabe siblings make a splash under the WWE banner too. And if you need an example of this, you need only look towards our next two subjects, LA Knight and Maxine Dupree. Yes, while it's easy to forget now, before he became the cult breakout sensation of current-day WWE, LA Knight was a totally different character. Yes, upon his main roster call-up, he'd be rebranded as Max Dupree. Who was Max Dupree? Well, he was the mouthpiece of Maximum Male Models, a mid-card gimmick involving two male models known as Marseille and Mansois. So because of this then, it meant Max Dupree never got a chance to shine in a way that he might have otherwise, as the goofiness of the whole thing threatened to smother him. And things only seemed to get worse for the Hagerstown native once his sister Maxine was brought on board to help manage the stable. Of course, Maxine wasn't Max's real sister though. No, she was a character portrayed by Sydney Smerzel. But so popular would she prove to be with fans, she'd end up sticking around even after Max Dupree turned back into his old gimmick of L.A. Knight. Yeah. Not that she'd remain a member of Maximum Male Models forever though. No, after Massey and Mansois found themselves out of the company, the kayfabe Dupree sister joined an all-new stable, Alpha Academy. Yes, it was at this point that Maxine started teaming up with Chad Gable, Otis, and Akira Tozawa, and this is a spot she remains in today, even if Gable has since left the group. As for her on-screen brother, L.A. Knight, well, his career has only gone from strength to strength because at SummerSlam in August of 24, he'd be the man to finally dethrone Logan Paul as United States Champion. And while he has since lost this belt to Shinsuke Nakamura, he remains in the chase to win it back again. Will this see him rope in his supposed sister to help him do so in the weeks to come? We're not sure, as WWE doesn't seem to acknowledge that family lineage between the two anymore. But we suppose the connection is still technically there, so who knows? Maybe before all is said and done, we'll see that reunion between the two. It would certainly be a nice callback, and it would be a nice way to elevate Maxine up to the next level on the card, as by this point, Knight has firmly established himself as an upper mid-carder / occasional main eventer, a level which his kayfabe sister has yet to reach. Not that everyone has to be a main eventer, of course. No, sometimes the brother in a brother-sister pairing can be a top act, all while the sister is in more of a mid-card role. Hell, this has been true since as far back as the 80s. And if you need any evidence of that being the case, you need only look towards our next subject, Jake the Snake Roberts and Rockin' Robin. Yes, this is one that not all fans are aware of, but Jake Roberts, star of WWF's Golden Era, actually had a sister who worked in WWE at the same time as him. Who was this sister? Well, she was Rockin' Robin. No, she may not have been a huge star in the WWF, partially because WWF's women's division back then wasn't as popular. But that didn't mean Robin Smith didn't find some level of success there, as while under Vince McMahon's employ, she'd become a WWF Women's Champion after beating Sensational Sherri for the honor. Aside from that, well, it would be mostly indie work for the North Carolinian, although she did get a brief run in Japan. One thing Rockin' Robin was never able to do, though, was be aligned on screen with her brother Jake, and the reason for that is probably because it would never really have fit Jake's character to have a sister. No, back during the 80s, the Snake was about as cerebral of a character as they came. Someone who, regardless of whether he was working as a heel or a babyface, always cut the most chilling promos designed to make the audience lean in and listen carefully. A far cry from the madness we'd be getting elsewhere on the show from the likes of Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior. And whenever he was in the ring, his style was always very deliberate in every movement he made. So having him introduce a sister into the mix wouldn't have made much sense then. No, he was far better served being a lone wolf who could exploit others' weaknesses rather than show one of his own. And this was especially true when he was playing the dastardly heel, as Rockin' Robin was always portrayed as a babyface to the audience, so having the two aligned at that point would have made even less sense from a character standpoint. Of course, none of this should suggest the two weren't close behind the scenes. No, whether they were working in the same company or in different ones, Jake and Robin always stood by each other's side and supported one another. But what about when one member of a famous pair of wrestling siblings isn't an in-ring performer? Well, that's the case with our next subjects, the children of the legendary Rey Mysterio, Dominic and Aaliyah. Yes, we all know who Rey Mysterio is. After all, he's arguably the greatest luchador to ever step inside of the squared circle. Up until a few years ago, though, all we knew of his children was that back during the Ruthless Aggression era, his son Dominic had got involved in that infamous angle in which Eddie Guerrero claimed to be his real father. You know the one we're talking about. It was the one that ended in the first and, to date only, custody of Dominic Mysterio ladder match. Of course, once 2019 rolled around, this would all change, however, and the reason everything would change here is because this was the point that Dom, now a fully grown man, decided to step into the ring again as a wrestler. And with this coming after his father had returned to WWE, it made all the sense in the world for the two to be paired up on screen at this point. The only problem with this pairing, though, was that it quickly became apparent the young rookie was being thrown into the deep end before he'd learned how to swim. and this would lead to a rough couple of years for him as he struggled to stay afloat in the world of WWE. But as we all know now, while this could have been the end of Dirty Dom, he was able to turn things around when in 2022, he turned heel and became the newest member of the Judgment Day, with him usually to be found around the arm of his mommy, Rhea Ripley, from that point onwards. And that led to him getting massively over all of a sudden as his heel antics became the coolest thing to boo in WWE in all of the right ways. Seriously, such a phenomenon would Dom become here? No one would really be talking about him as the son of Rey Mysterio after a while. Rather, they'd be talking about him as his own man, one who'd be able to go down to NXT on a whim and win the North American Championship on 2 separate occasions. Yes, as sons of famous wrestlers go, Dominic Mysterio has to be considered a massive success at this point. But he's not the only child of Ray Ray's who's stepped inside the ring in recent years because, while she may have never wrestled herself, his daughter Aaliyah would also make her presence felt on WWE TV. How would she do that? Well, primarily it would be as a brief love interest of Buddy Murphy in 2020, back when Murphy and Seth Rollins were engaged in a feud with the Mysterios. Needless to say then, this caused a lot of on-screen friction between the siblings. And it also gave us the strange trivia note of both brother and sister having on-screen romantic pairings with a real-life married couple, Murphy and Rhea Ripley. More so than that, though, it gave Aaliyah a chance to show what she could do as a performer. That said, it doesn't seem like this was something she felt the need to continue with for the long term, as since that angle has ended, she's only been seen in the crowd at WWE shows, usually cheering her father on. Outside of that, she seems to have returned to her regular life. One brother-sister duo who can never return to a life out of the spotlight is our next one, though, and the reason for that is as the children of Vince McMahon, Shane and Stephanie McMahon have been involved in the wrestling industry since the day they were born. That's right, from their very first day on this earth, both Shane and Stephanie have had WWE running through their blood, and that was why, long before either of them became regular on-screen characters, they'd be doing work for the company, with Shane occasionally being seen as a referee and Stephanie doing some early modeling work for WWF Magazine. Of course, this was always going to be temporary though, as it was only going to be a matter of time before they did something more substantial, and the first of them to do this would be Shane in 1998. What happened with Shane in 1998? Well, this was the point he would first be acknowledged on screen as the heir apparent to the company, with him quickly proving to be an entertaining character as not only an authority figure, but also a wrestler. Sure, you could argue his matches were always more stunt shows than technical clinics, but he was able to make this work for him to the point that during the Attitude Era alone, he'd become a one-time European champion and a one-time hardcore champion. And then there was Stephanie. She'd debut a year later in 1999, and while she was at first presented as the innocent apple of her father's eye, she'd quickly morph into a villainess for the ages, with her on-screen pairing with her future real-life husband Triple H causing many headaches for the babyface roster at the turn of the millennium. And like with her brother, Stephanie wouldn't just be content with pulling the strings from a position of authority. No, she'd step inside the ring herself from time to time too, with her most notable moment being the time she became WWF Women's Champion. Sure, as time went on, things would sour on the Shane front when, after it became clear he was in fact not going to inherit the company once his dad stepped down, he left the WWE to instead go and pursue other business interests. But Stephanie would always remain part of the WWE, even if she at one point became more of an occasional on-screen presence. And it wasn't like her brother would remain away from the family business forever. No, it was in 2016 that Shane made his triumphant return to a WWE ring, and in the process was able to reignite that old sibling rivalry as both brother and sister battled it out for supremacy as the commissioners of Raw and SmackDown. So at this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking Shane and Stephanie remain in WWE today, and with Vince out of the promotion, they'd oversee the whole show. But that's not the case. No, after tearing his quad during an impromptu match against The Miz at WrestleMania 39, Shane would leave the company once more. And as for Stephanie, well, she resigned in 2023. Yes, we're now in a situation where there are no McMahons officially working for WWE anymore. But what about our next subject? A truly bizarre pair we got back in 2008 between Paul and Katie Lee Burchill. And yes, just like with Max and Maxine Dupree, Paul and Katie Lee Burchill were not real-life siblings. Rather, they were just kayfabe ones put together on screen by Vince McMahon, with them being played by Paul Burchill and Katarina Waters. But that makes the whole thing a little easier to swallow because anyone who remembers this storyline will remember the creepy overtones it had to it. That's right, the gimmick of the Burchill siblings was that they were a little too close for comfort, with it being heavily implied that they were in a relationship with one another. And so that was why they'd spend 2008 and 2009 trying to get the whole thing over on brands like SmackDown and WWE CW. No matter what they did though, nothing was going to make the Burchells popular with fans, at least not in this incarnation. And so it was that once WWE CW ended, the act would quietly be dropped from TV, never to be mentioned again. But at least it didn't mark complete career death for the performers involved, because once it was over, they would be able to continue on for a while, with Paul returning to the indie circuit to ply his craft there for a couple of years, all before retiring from the ring and becoming a firefighter instead, while Katie Lee would move over to TNA and there become a 2-time Knockouts champion and 1-time Knockouts tag team champion. Yes, it's a shame that the seedy parts of their on-screen pairing couldn't have been avoided, as if this was done differently, Paul and Katie Lee Burchell may have made for a solid kayfabe brother-sister duo, one that could have found a fair amount of success during the PG era. But it was what it was, and we can't turn the clocks back. So instead, we'll just have to put this one down as a loss and proof that not all sibling relationships in wrestling are great. As for the other ones we've looked at today though, well, many of them are great in their own ways, with those proving that sometimes if you want to get ahead, it's best to get some help from the family.